laka ding dong. A boom, a shaka, a boom, a shaka laka, a boom, shaka laka ding dong. Half an hour late today. Sorry about that, guys. But here we are. Let's make sure we're live. Coast to coast. Round the world. Ira TV. True story. Back when I was doing sketch comedy, I wanted to have a YouTube channel named Ira TV. But I never did, and that's why that's a terrible story. Share to a group. There it is. The Starfarers Guild. Hello, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Apologies for the little bit of a late start here. But we're up and running. It looks like things are looking good over here on the computer. That's what I'm doing anytime I'm ever looking right down here, computer, making sure everything's working well. And it looks like it is. So let's do this. Let us not delay any further. We have words to read. Exciting things are happening in the land of Starstuff. Let's see where we left off. I believe Balta had a plan to get past the Authority capital ship, which is now on the other side of the gateway between them and the Outer Rim, looking for them. And yes, we just saw the Master Purveyor is very upset about the ships being destroyed, wants them alive, and he kind of crushed one of Slink's companions, which we realized was a kid inside there, and that's not good. All right, that's the ketchup. That's the mayonnaise and the mustard. And it's towards the end of the week here, people. Feeling punchy. But let's dive in, because we got some exciting chapters to read, if I recall correctly. Without further ado, chapter 41. Petrick felt like he weighed 2,000 pounds. The pressure suits were bulky, even for adults, and certainly none of them were designed for children. Fortunately, they were constructed of a fairly collapsible, if not thin, material. It was the helmets that posed the biggest problem. Petrick could have turned himself a full 360 degrees if his arms and legs hadn't been slipped into the cavernous arms and legs of the suit. The gloved and booted ends blessedly had clamping mechanisms that Balta had put around the children's wrists and ankles. The extra fabric billowed out from their shortened limbs, and Susie had laughed right into Petrick's faceplate when she'd seen him all done up. He was relieved to see her acting like her usual self. The faceplate was another challenge, as it kept riding up Petrick's forehead every time he took a step, meaning the non-transparent bottom of the helmet went up over his eyes, and he had to crane his neck to try to peek over it and see what was happening. Susie's laughter quickly turned to grumbles when the same thing happened to her, and then Barry managed to laugh at the both of them as they struggled to wrangle the awkward suits. He was sitting on the ground, unable to stand with the extra weight in his injured leg. Balta told them to settle down, and that the suits weren't meant to be used inside gravity plating anyway. They were intended to be used outside, in the weightless vacuum. She'd done quite a bit of grunting on her own, getting into her suit with her large frame, having precisely the opposite challenge as her diminutive tagalongs. Haber wasn't suiting up, Petrick noticed, and the android walked over and checked Balta's work on assembling his pressure suit. Apparently, Haber was satisfied, and he clicked Petrick's helmet into its final locked position with a telltale hiss. "You don't need a pressure suit?" Petrick asked him. Haber pointed to his ears and shook his head at Petrick. He couldn't hear. He pointed to something inside Petrick's helmet, and Petrick craned his head around to try to see what he was referring to. A switch, perhaps? That would activate a speaker of some kind? But Haber shook his head at Petrick again to get his attention, and then pointed again. This time, Petrick saw what the android was gesturing to. It was a sticker on the inside of the helmet that spelled out the phrase, "Speak to activate." "Activate?" he said. "Very good," Petrick said back, seemingly right into Petrick's ear. He looked at Haber again, and the android was nodding. Your suit AI is voice-activated," he said. "Much more useful than using one of only 2 hands you have when you're extra-vehicular to push some infernal button." "How can I hear you in my helmet, or you hear me?" "Your suits have been marked with the transmission frequency of your comm signal. I've attenuated my vocal and auditory processors to match it." "Sometimes," Petrick said slowly with a grin, "you are just the coolest, Haber." Petrick heard Susie and Barry click on a moment later, and they each tested their systems out. It seemed as though they were all connected. "So you don't need a suit, Haber?" Barry asked, echoing Petrick's forgotten question from moments earlier. "No, Master Barry," Haber answered. "Not for short periods of exposure. I do not require oxygen as you do to function. The cold, however, will force me into hibernation shutdown, as it did in the cargo hold on our way from Indikar, if I stay exposed for too long." "It won't be long," said Balta. "These pea-suits only have 10 minutes of air tops. These pea-suits have only 10 minutes of air, 20 tops, anyway." "What about Clark?" Petrick asked. Petrick glanced down to his feet to get a view of Clark. They'd placed the dog into a pressure crate that Haber had found in the locker. It had been designed as a sort of toolkit for anything that needed to maintain a temperature above vacuum temp, like mechanical devices that would otherwise freeze. But Clark, being as small as he was, he fit in quite nicely, and he even had a window through which to watch. He was lying down, like a good dog, eyes alert. "Does he need air, and that's why he's in the crate?" Barry chimed in. His curiosity was still in full force. "Not oxygen," Haber answered, "but he is not suited for the cold, as I am." Petrick picked the crate up with a gloved hand. "I'm ready," he said. "Let's go." "Hold your horses, boy," Balta chided. "We all need to get tied in." Balta had a tether line that she'd attached to herself, and she threaded it through the fastened belts of each of the children's pea-suits and through the handle of Clark's crate, and then handed it off to Haber, who clipped the far end into his torso. She then gave Haber a rather large backpack-like apparatus to put on, and she put one on herself as well. Petrick recognized them as the thruster packs Balta had found nearby. The pirate captain said she had experience with them from her mining days. "I'll be letting you handle the main booster, Barnes," she said, nodding to Haber. "You'll have the better view of everything, and I'll hold up the back of the tether line. We'll keep mine as a backup for corrections." Haber nodded. "We'll head straight for a rock or chunk of debris," Balta explained further, going over the plan one last time. "You clip us onto that, and we can ride that cover to the ship." "And we know where that is?" Susie asked. Balta held up the comm link so they could all see it. "Colossus will give us a low-powered signal to home in on as soon as we get closer to the Red Robert. Now, everyone in tight." Haber hoisted Barry up, and they all came into a huddle together by the entrance of the airlock. "This whole chamber is going to start to depressurize when we cycle this door. That means air will rush right out from where we're standing, so we don't want to be standing here long. Hold on to your tethers." Petrick peered up through his oversized helmet and caught sight of the airlock chamber beyond them through the window in the door. It was jagged and sparking. Beyond was the wall, and the massive capital ship set in front of it, waiting for them. And they were about to launch themselves out there right toward it. "I hope this works," he quickly thought. He clenched Clark's case a little tighter, even though it was now securely on the tether line. He felt Susie's grip on him and saw Haber holding on to Barry. Barry was still looking pale behind his faceplate, and he was sweating, but he gave the group a "let's do this" thumbs up. "Here we go," Balta said. She threw a lever by the side of the airlock door, and Petrick could feel clanks at their feet as something mechanical moved in response. He realized that he'd closed his eyes, and he opened them when nothing happened. A light from the inner airlock door bathed them all in red. The light switched to green. The door they were standing to the side of swung open, and with a slam, the air took Petrick out at the legs. He was mid-fall when the tether yanked him forward from his torso, and just as fast, they were outside the airlock and spinning uncontrollably. It was a lucky thing that they were outside too, because all around them debris was hurtling past from the corridor, debris that had been sucked out the opening they'd just been standing in. Petrick felt a violent, gut-wrenching yank on his tether, and he bumped butt first into Haber's waiting grip. He turned around to see the rest of the group now clustered together, their spin slowing as the backpack Haber was controlling made several quick correcting bursts from its small thrusters. The tether had become hopelessly tangled, and Haber and Barry were struggling to get themselves untwisted. "We must find cover, android!" Balta barked at Haber, and Petra could see why. The capital ship, as big as it had been from the station, was now impossibly large from their view outside. It filled their vision, and as small as he knew their little group was, he felt that entire ship must be staring right at them. It was right there. Haber had anticipated this, or was taking advantage of his superior reflexes. No sooner had Balta barked out the command, Haber had snagged a sizable rock that was nearby. Petrick felt his tether jerk, and he lost his grip on Clark's crate. He needn't have worried. Clark was still firmly attached to the line. A few more tether jerks later, and Haber had hauled the group in, each of them finding purchase on the craggy rock face. The android had chosen well. The rock was large enough for them all to hide behind, barely, but it didn't seem so large as to be impractical to control. Haber was already testing his thruster jets, steadying the spin of the rock. They were currently and blessedly out of sight, but if the rock were to continue to roll, and they stayed put, they'd be right back within view of the Authority ship in seconds. Petrick's tether had the most slack of the jumbled group, the last one hauled into the rock, and he was therefore on the far edge of their hiding place. He thought for a brief, terrifying moment that he was, in fact, going to rotate back into view of the capital ship, but right as that seemed inevitable, Balta kicked on her thruster pack and halted their drift. Haber nodded at the pirate captain. The rock felt steady. "Is everyone all right?" Haber said into each of their helmets. It was odd to hear his voice but not see his mouth moving. Everyone chimed in that they were okay, and the android instructed the children on how to ask each of their onboard suit AIs for a status check. Petrick's helmet chattered back after the verbal command with a list of various values, which Petrick relayed to Haber after Susie and Barry each did the same. Haber seemed satisfied all was well, and he turned his attention back to Balta, who was wrangling her comlink out of a secure pouch on the side of her suit. "We should untangle the tether lines," Haber called to her, but Balta shook her head no inside her helmet. "Let's figure out how far we are away first," she said. In the momentary lull, Petrick decided to venture to the edge of the rock and take a peek just around the corner to see the capital ship. He leaned over and craned his neck to see out of the very top portion of his helmet. Guys?" he said upon getting a view of where they were heading. Balta and Haber didn't answer immediately. "Guys!" It was the one thing they hadn't considered. It was all fine and good to be hanging onto the back of a rock, blocked from the view of the capital ship. What wasn't fine and good was that by the very nature of their position, they couldn't see where they were going, and where they were going was directly toward the nose of the giant capital ship. "We're going to hit the ship!" Petrick shouted to the two adults. Petrick could see Balta's round face widen in realization of what the boy was telling her, and then freeze. Haber, on the other hand, immediately stopped what he was doing and started crawling up the back of the rock to peer over the top, similarly to how Petrick had spotted their impending doom. He got a good look, then snapped his head back down and crawled right back to the group. "Huddle close," he said to them, and they all obliged wordlessly. "We have to change course," Balta said to the android. "No time," Haber said back. He was right. A moment later, they were all jarred up against the rock face they'd been hanging on to as the rock smacked right into the capital ship. If it had been any harder, if their rock transport had been traveling with any real velocity, it would have made pancakes out of them and punched straight through into the giant ship. As it was, they clanked off of it and began to spin away in an entirely new direction. Petrick realized with horror that their new spin was whipping them right into view. He could feel the vibrations of Haber behind him, trying to compensate with the thrusters, but it was far too late. They swung fully into view, and Petrick couldn't help but look. They'd smacked right against a giant window in what appeared to be the command center. Fully visible and impossible to miss stood out 3 figures, or rather 2 figures, standing over a third who was on the floor. Of those standing, one was gaunt, stooped, and familiar. The other was tall and broad, his back to them, looking down. The tall, wide man turned after the rock clanged into the side of his ship, and Petrick's breath caught in his throat, sure that they would be spotted. His profile came into view. Petrick gasped. It was like being struck by lightning. The man started to disappear from view as their rock spun, and Petrick scrambled on instinctively toward the edge, trying to keep him in sight, to make sure he'd actually seen what he thought he'd seen. "Petrick!" Susie cried after him, and she pulled as hard as she could on the tether that connected him to her, but Petrick couldn't stop. The rock edge was rising toward him, toward the top of his stupidly large helmet. The man's body was facing fully now toward the rock, though his head was still looking down. Even though it was getting smaller as they moved away, Petrick could see the face rise up to look out the window. Petrick thought for a moment they even locked eyes. And then it was gone. The rock had steadied. With a heave, Susie yanked him back to the group. "What is wrong with you?" she yelled at him, and slapped him on his oversized helmet as hard as she could with her gigantic gloved hand in the vacuum of space. Petrick didn't answer. He couldn't. He didn't know if he'd seen what he thought he'd seen. The adults, for their part, were far too busy with their tumbling ride to pursue the matter. To boot, Balta's comlink was now flashing furiously at them with alternating red lights. As soon as both he and Haber looked convinced they'd stopped the rock from putting them back into view of the capital ship, Balta took the small cylinder and keyed back a response. A moment later, a similar set of flashing responses came back. Balta raised the device up and let out a bellow. "Ah!" she said in exultation. "Good robot!" They were starting to enter the dust cloud, which was rapidly thickening as they moved further away from the station and its field generators, which kept the wall at bay. "Colossus is close by, I hope," Haber said, looking at his thruster pack's fuel gauge. "Our course correction has nearly depleted my fuel." "Close enough," Balta answered with a grin. "Close enough. I could kiss that shiny hunk of metal." As that uncomfortable image set itself into the children's brains, Balta quickly conversed with Haber about how best to traverse the distance to the Red Robert. It was immediately evident they lacked the thruster fuel to change the trajectory of their rocky hiding place again. They were going to have to ditch it and huddle together in open space to rendezvous with their ship. It was too risky, they decided, for the ship to move to them, lest it was spotted, being several orders of magnitude larger than they were. Leaving the rock meant untangling their tethers, and the children were instructed to hold tight to the rock while everyone was detached, and then re-threaded to the safety line. Petrick looked around as the soup of the dust cloud thickened as the adults worked. Visibility was rapidly decreasing due to that, and the fact that the lights of the station and the ship were quickly receding. He looked behind them, in the direction in which their rock was traveling, and saw the depths of the far side of the wall stretched out beyond. "Did I really see what I thought I saw?" he wondered as he peered into the darkness. He felt another tug on his tether from Susie. He looked at her. Through her helmet, he saw her nod toward Balta and Haber, who he realized were addressing the children about their imminent departure from the rock. "Just like when we blew out of the airlock," Haber was saying, gesturing to each of their newly attached tethers. "This time, we're going to stay locked arm in arm together to avoid any stray pulling on the tethers that will make it impossible to navigate." Petrick nodded, picking up the gist of the conversation. He glanced at Susie, and she glanced back, mouthing, "What is wrong with you?" Petrick shrugged as an answer, though he wasn't entirely sure after completing the gesture that she actually saw anything, given the gigantically oversized nature of his pressure suit. "Link in," Haber instructed. They crawled in toward each other. Petrick grabbed Clark's crate handle and checked on the dog. The window had fogged over, but sensing Petrick's scrutiny, Clark pressed his nose up to it and panted. Apparently, the insulation was working perfectly. He looked downright warm. Petrick linked arms with Haber on one side and Susie on the other. Balta linked with her and with Barry. Barry linked back again with Haber to complete the circle. That put Haber and Balta opposite each other in the small huddle they had formed. This made more sense than a straight line. In this closed circle, with one set of thrusters facing one direction and the second set facing the other, they'd be able to make coordinated thruster bursts that covered either trajectory of their momentum, forward and reverse. As long as they stayed connected and tight to each other, they could also rotate the circle as necessary to change the thruster's angles and move side to side or up and down. "Ready?" Balta called out. "Ready!" was the response from the children. They let go of the rock, and Haber pushed them off with a steady movement of his legs. Petrick was surprised at the velocity with which they immediately sprang from their hiding place. They hurtled away from it, and as they continued to glide out into open space with nothing to stop them, there was nothing to slow them down out in the frictionless vacuum. It underscored just how vital having a thruster pack was. There was absolutely nothing to push against and change your course if you made a mistake. "Whoa," said Barry across from Petrick. He was looking glossy-eyed behind Petrick. Petrick tried to turn in his suit to look in the direction of the station, but his helmet was blocking the way. He considered for the briefest of seconds unlinking one of his arms to try and move his helmet so he could see, but the shove of a thruster blast from Haber nixed that impulse very quickly. A rock about the size of the one they'd just left hurtled swiftly, safely, past them. Haber was doing his job well. The course correction also had the effect of rotating them just enough so that Petrick could see what Barry had been marveling at. Through the dust cloud and spinning rocks, Liberatia had an eerie glow to it from this distance. The capital ship hung in front of it, still looking just as imposing, even from much further away. Now and then there was a flash as an energy beam lanced out from the mighty ship at some smaller object. The explosions, it would seem, had stopped. From this distance, it struck Petrick how incredible it was that they'd managed to get beyond the ship. It appeared to be stretching its fingers out in every visible direction, searching. "Barry?" It was Susie calling out. Petrick turned back and instantly realized that Barry hadn't said "whoa" because of the carnage behind them at the station. He'd been losing consciousness. His head lolled to the side of the helmet. His face was now a deathly pale, and his hair was drenched against his forehead. "Incoming!" It was Haber, who'd never taken his eyes and focus off where they were headed. A rock half the size of the Red Robert was hurtling right toward them. "I see it," Balta said. Neither of them, unfortunately, had seen what was happening to Barry. A sharp tug on Petrick's arm signaled another quick maneuvering burst from Haber's thrusters, but this time Barry's unconscious arms could not cling to his partners. His link to his partners slipped the second their trajectory changed. Susie screamed in panic. The two adults stopped their thrusters mid-maneuver, but it was too late. Barry ripped away from the rest of the group, his tether streaming after him. That's the end of chapter 41. Hopefully the stream is nice and stable today. All right. Let's dive into chapter 42. Chapter 42. "Barry!" Petrick yelled, and he began to unhook himself from Haber to go after his friend, who was tumbling away at an alarming rate. "No!" Haber called to Petrick, and the android tightened his grip on him. Petrick struggled against him in panic as Barry reached the end of his tether. It snapped tautly and held. Blessedly, it held. And Barry began to drift 300 feet away or so. 300 or so feet away. Petrick saw with dismay that their interrupted maneuver had put them even closer to the oncoming rock. Its telltale black shadow was looming large, and they were heading straight for it. Barry was a perfect outline against its darkness. "We have to move," Haber called. "We have to get Barry," Susie cried. Petrick saw Balta glance for a split second at the android, and then start hauling in Barry's tether. The silent message between the adults was clear. They didn't dare maneuver with the group unlinked as it was. They'd be completely out of control, an endless circle of cause and effect with crisscrossing angles of trajectory. "Help me," Balta grunted to Haber. "Help me," Balta grunted to Haber. Barry was still 50 feet away, and Petrick realized that Balta wasn't going to be fast enough. They had nothing to brace themselves against in the vacuum, and Barry could offer no counter-resistance to them, limp as he was. The rock hurtling toward them couldn't have been more than 300 feet away, easily traveling at 30 feet per second. "Barry!" Haber called out over the intercom. "Barry, can you hear me?" No response. "We need you to pull against us, kid," Balta called. "Come on!" Nothing. The looming rock was the size of a house, was maybe 8 seconds away. "Susie!" Petrick heard Haber cry out. "What are you doing?" Petrick turned to see her unclipping her tether. She then grabbed hold of Petrick, turned her body away from him, planted her feet, and pushed off him as hard as her little legs would let her. The rock was 5 seconds away. She shot out like a cannonball, and her aim was true. She crashed into the motionless Barry and wrapped her short limbs around him in a full body hug. "Good girl!" Balta yelled to her. "Click in! Click in!" She was gesturing frantically to her tether clip. Susie fumbled with it, all dexterity lost because the giant gloves meant for adult-sized hands. The rock was maybe 3 seconds away. "Susie!" Petrick screamed. She didn't have time. She understood. Thank the stars, she understood. She abandoned the clip and wrapped her tether around her arm once, twice, 3 times. She looked back to the group, just able to peer over the bottom of her helmet's faceplate. "Pull!" Balta commanded. She did. They did. The rock was a second away. The opposed resistance on the tether snapped the 2 ends toward each other, and Barry and Susie crashed into the rest of the group. Haber had alertly angled himself to receive the incoming Barry and Susie at his side, so that their momentum swung his back to the rock. The adult hands were vices as they linked into the children. Haber fired his thrusters. The rock was so close it glowed red where the pinpoints of fire touched it. Their acceleration banged Petrick's head against the back of his helmet. Haber cut his burst, and Balta fired a second later, giving them an angle away from the rock. Once she cut her thrusters, confident they were out of harm's way, Balta whooped in exultation. "Nice flying, android," she said. Haber nodded, looking as simultaneously shaken and relieved. He turned his attention to Barry, who remained unmoving in the tangled mass that connected him to Susie. Susie was tapping on his helmet, trying to wake him up. His face was even paler than it had been a minute before, his forehead pressed on the front of his helmet. Petrick could see no movement. Susie looked at Haber, eyes wide with dread. "Is he dead?" Haber put a hand on her shoulder. "No," he said, and he pointed to the area of Barry's faceplate where his mouth was practically touching it. A tiny little circle of condensation formed, evaporated, formed again, evaporated. "He's still breathing." "Is he going to be okay?" Petrick asked. "What's happening to him?" Susie said, overlapping Petrick's question. "I would hazard a guess that Master Barry's leg is Try that again. "I would hazard a guess that Master Barry's leg is bleeding rather seriously," the android answered. "We must get him inside, quickly." Petrick looked around. They were drifting slowly now. "Do we know where we are?" "I did not have time to plot our new trajectory," Haber said. "I'm afraid we may have put ourselves quite a bit off course. Captain Balta, perhaps you can—" "There she is!" Balta cried out, nearly exploding Petrick's eardrum. He followed the captain's sightline, which went down below them and slightly to Petrick's right. He had to squint to see through the dusty muck and spinning rocks. Just as he was about to ask what in the stars Balta was hollering about, he saw a small red flash of light. The shadow of the Red Robert emerged against the dusty backdrop once he had that point to fix upon. "I see it!" Susie exclaimed. "I see it too," Petrick chimed. It seemed so far away, and in the darkness it was really hard to tell how fast they were moving, but Petrick soon saw that the shape was growing steadily larger as they approached. It was like a beacon of hope, as much as a shadow against the dust and stars can be a beacon. There were no running lights on, of course, given that they were hiding. The Red Robert would have been impossible to see if Balta had not been pointing directly at it. It was the most welcoming blob shadow Petrick thought that he had ever seen. "Thankfully," Haber said with the faintest glimmer of hope, "we did not throw ourselves too far off course after all." He then turned his attention to the rest of the group. "Is everyone okay? Susie, are you damaged?" Susie answered in the negative. She was all right. Haber had her and Balta both request status updates from their suits, and those both checked out relatively fine as well. Susie was getting low on oxygen, but not enough to be worrisome now that the Red Robert had been spotted down below them. Satisfied, he let off a series of very light, controlled bursts, and Petrick once again felt the slight push of acceleration as they drifted down toward their waiting home. As they got closer, the dust cleared, and details of the hull came into view. Balta was making course corrections with Haber now as well, slowing their descent down to the ship and lining them up with what soon became visible as an airlock. Once they were finally within a few feet of the ship, Balta slowed them significantly with braking maneuvers, and Haber then used his thrusters to rotate them so that the airlock was above them, at their heads. Slowly, they drifted up toward it, and when they were within an arm's length, Balta reached out and grabbed one of the handholds just outside the airlock door. The move swung the whole group around her, and they banged up against it. "Just hang out there," she said to them as she grabbed a lever with her gloved hand. A couple twists later, the airlock door swung inward, and Petrick tumbled inside and straight down onto the floor with a grunt. "Gravity plating is working," he said wryly as Susie plopped down next to him, along with Clark's crate. Haber extended his leg as he floated over the threshold, holding Barry's unconscious body so that when they crossed into the gravity field, he could settle Barry to the floor gracefully and carefully. Balta was right behind him, doing the same motion, but she'd extended the wrong leg for the way she was leaning, and she clanked down hard on her other knee. Petrick might have laughed at her if the circumstances had been less worrisome. Balta rested herself to her feet and staggered over to the control panel on the far inside wall of the airlock. Petrick tried to stand, but his own legs started to quiver like jelly and quickly gave out. He crumpled back to the floor. Apparently, the weightlessness of space had momentarily sapped them of all their strength. "You'll have a nasty case of space legs," Balta said from the wall panel. "Just take it slow, and you'll be fine." There was a sudden rushing sound. Petrick realized it was the first sound he'd heard outside of his own helmet for quite some time. He realized that air was flooding into the room. Balta had closed the outer airlock door. Petrick just hadn't heard it because a vacuum conducts no sound. He saw Balta remove her helmet, take in a deep, very satisfying breath, and let it out slow. Petrick took his helmet off too, as did Susie, and they mimicked Balta. The air was stale, not particularly sweet-smelling or otherwise pleasant, but it was warm. "How is Barry?" Susie asked Haber the instant she rested her helmet off. Haber, unaffected by space legs, was unwrapping Barry from his suit with precise, quick movements. Susie tried to move toward them, but tumbled back to the ground before she could take a step. Balta stumbled over to her, grabbed her by the armpits, and hoisted her upright. "You don't ever listen, do you?" she muttered. Together, they teetered toward Haber and Barry. Petrick followed them by smartly not trying to stand, but opting to crawl instead. What's wrong with him? Petrick asked when he caught sight of his friend's face. It was very, very still. Is he dead? Susie asked. The question caught in her throat. Haber didn't answer. Off went the upper part of the suit. Still, Barry didn't wake up. He was fine when we left the station, Petrick said. Balta slumped down onto the airlock next to the children. The legs of Barry's suit were stuck, and so in a flash, Haber ripped them down the seams. Petrick gasped. Susie shut her eyes. Blood had pooled in the bottom of the airtight suit, so much blood, and it was still oozing from the leg wound Petrick had bound for him back on the station. Guilt stabbed at Petrick's chest, and the room began to spin. He's bleeding out, Haber reported. But I wrapped him tight, Petrick said, staring at the bandage, overwhelmed with blood. Just like you told me. Haber got Balta's attention. Do you have a medical bay on board? He asked. Balta nodded and grunted herself to her feet. We do. It's just down. At that moment, the airlock door to the ship's interior clanged open. Colossus stood in the doorway. Colossus, Balta called to the robot, not wasting any time for hellos. Take him to the infirmary. Colossus responded immediately and wordlessly. He stomped over to them, slid his shining arms under Barry's body, and lifted him in one smooth motion. Carefully, Balta called after him as he left the airlock. She then nodded to Haber. Follow him. He'll show you where it is. Haber gave a curt nod and rose to leave. Before departing, he stopped and put a hand on Petrick's shoulder, and he waited to speak until Petrick raised his head to look at him. The android's ice-blue eyes were focused, deliberate. Master Barry's leg bled through his bandage, he said. This didn't happen because it was loose. Haber squeezed. It's not your fault. All right, scene break. I'm going to take a little sip of water. The fall of Liberatia unfolded in front of them. The capital ship, a giant beast, was gobbling and gobbling, trying to satiate a bottomless appetite. From the dark, shut-down cockpit of the Red Robert, Petrick and Balta had a peeping view of the tragic scene. No ships, no people, no part of the station could escape the maw of the Authority and its capital ship. One by one, the lights in the old station went out. One by one, the glimmers of each fleeing ship were swallowed in. The two largest ships, Dedran and Eris's colony ship and the Tusian battleship, were lightless and listing to their sides. Petrick wondered if their Indicaran friends had ever made it onto their ship. He tried not to wonder what was happening to them now. Balta pointed out that there were no longer explosions. The lights were disappearing because they were being turned off or swallowed into the capital ship's holding bays, not from destruction. They're looking for us alive, Balta said. They're looking for me, Petrick said. Yeah, well, they won't find you. This is all my fault. Balta sighed. No, it isn't, kid. It is. The ship wouldn't be here if I wasn't here. True, but you're not driving that ship. They fire those weapons. They tractor in those ships. Because of me. Listen, bad people do bad things. That's what makes them bad. You did not make them do that. They did it all on their own. They are responsible for themselves. I led my friends out here. That means I'm responsible for whatever happens to them. Petrick finally took his eyes away from the scene. Balta understood. Your friends are going to be okay, she said, patting the boy awkwardly on the shoulder. The android said so. The boy crumpled. Balta wasn't sure if he was feeling relieved now, or guilty, or just overwhelmed. And she sure as hell didn't know. And she sure as hell wasn't sure what else she could do for him or say. So, Balta silently stood for a while, just to be there. She stayed until she felt as though the boy would rather be alone, and then she left. For a long, long while, Petrick watched alone and in silence. All the lights disappeared, and only the gleaming, curved hull of that giant ship remained. It hung there, still hungry, still looking for its true prey, knowing it was still out there somewhere, but suddenly unsure as to where to look. Balta had made it clear they would not be moving an inch until the capital ship was gone, and from the efficiency with which any shiny moving object seemed to be snatched up, it was a solid plan. The pirate haven of millennia, perhaps longer, was now gone. Only the husk of the ancient webbed station, buried in the middle of the Great Wall, remained. It looked as if no one had ever been back to it since those unknown aliens, so many years ago, had occupied it. Petrick was sure much wickedness had been reined in today. Liberatia was no utopia, but it had been free. Women and men had been free to travel where they wished, which was the only kind of freedom that really counted in space. He wondered if other pirates, among the inner systems and scattered about the outer rim, would have heard already of the fall of their trade city. How fast did news still travel in these times of dried-up will and hope? Hope robbed by his own father? The same father who tortured him now at night with pleas for help, who dragged his friends along with himself toward the clutches of slave traders and marketplaces, and who had been hiding, cowardly, watching the last free city of man fall in his name. Kronos had been right. He wanted to leave, to stop watching, but he couldn't. He kept his eyes on the capital ship, waiting for it to move, thinking about what he'd thought he'd seen, but couldn't believe, wasn't sure, could have been a trick of the lighting. He'd been so far away after all, but the face was burned into his memory, a face he'd seen every night for his entire life. Kronos had been right. His father had been on the bridge of that capital ship, along with that bent old man. Petrick had seen him, and he knew he had to do something about it. And that's the end of chapter 42. Oh boy. All right, well, Barry's going to be okay. Or at least Balta says that Barry's going to be okay. But yeah, Petrick thinks he saw Fenton on the capital ship, on the bridge of the capital ship. Crazy! All right, you guys. It's really starting to come down to it. This is how much we have left. That little bit there. Same time, same place tomorrow. We'll pick up where we left off. We'll see if our heroes can actually get away from the capital ship and not be seen, and what it is that Petrick has decided he needs to do about the fact that his dad is over on that ship, or at least he thinks he is. So yeah, thank you so much for listening. Such a pleasure to do this. Let me know if you have any questions, concerns, comments, whatever. Be happy to answer for them, and I will see everyone tomorrow.